Hi, we're Nicole Majka, Felix Rau, and Gabriele Schwiertz from the University of Cologne and Bangor University. Our topic today is vagueness in metadata. We will start by introducing the problem of vagueness in metadata description by briefly presenting two surveys into the usage of metadata in the language documentation community. Next, we will focus on two important metadata categories and show how vague they actually are. After that, we'll explore the vagueness, what vagueness means, different subtypes, and how this impacts our ability to interact with language documentation data. And lastly, we will explore possible solutions. While analyzing practices in metadata creation and usage in the language documentation community, we analyzed two major areas. First, we surveyed portals in the Dilemma network and harvesters like OLAC and the VLO, and noted down what information from the metadata was displayed prominently on their web pages. For example, what is displayed on the landing page, what gets used in facets and for sorting data sets, and what is selected to be displayed for a single data set once it is clicked on. Here we wanted to understand what the curators viewed as important and useful categories. The graphic on this slide shows the fields that were most commonly used as facets or for sorting. The most common information here is the contributor of the dataset, followed by information on language and location. We will look at those two categories in more detail later. The second survey we conducted was into the question, what do language documenters find important or useful? We looked at the IMDI metadata for the Dobes archive housed at the TLA in Nijmegen. We surveyed a total of 24,655 bundles of IMDI metadata. This dataset was from 2016, shortly before the migration of the Dobes data to SIMD. We wanted to take a deeper look into how field workers used the IMDI standards, how they made use of the categories. In the figure here, we plotted all language mentions in the Dobes corpus. There were a total of 513 languages. Among those, we find German and ancient Greek in a number of bundles. What is happening here is that the languages describing the actors and the languages describing the content of the session have been conflated. If we try to be more specific and zoom in only on the content languages, we find that the Dobes corpus is a great resource for Spanish and English, also Portuguese. Again, we can see that the category is still too vague. Content languages include the object language and the language of translation. Nicole will now present a closer look at those two categories, language and location, and their many meanings.
Thank you very much, Gabriele. Let's now take a look at language and location specifically. For each of these categories, we could make out 4 possible main meanings. Next, we checked various metadata structures to see which of these meanings are being covered. We examined schema.org, DataSite, OLAC, IMDI, the structure of the German Institute in Mannheim, following coded as IDS, the structure of the Language Corpora Center in Hamburg, following coded as HZSK, and BLAM, which is created by co-presenter Felix Rau. For language, we could make out the following meanings: content language, the language the resource is in; subject language, the language the resource is about; actor language, language used or known by a participant; and translation language, language the resource has been translated into. Subject and content language are covered by most of the metadata structures. However, some of them do not use different tags. This is caused by vague definitions. For example, DataSite, where language is defined as the primary language of the resource. Here one cannot be entirely sure what is meant, whether it describes the subject language or the content language. Also, it is possible to name more than one language in the IDS structure, but it will be unspecified which function which language fulfills. Next, let's take a look at location. We could make out the following meanings: location of the resource, where the resource is stored; recording location, where the resource was recorded; location of the subject language or dialect; or location of actor, where does the participant come from or where does the participant live. Most of the metadata structures cover recording location and or the location of language or dialect. Here as well, some of the structures do not have separate tags for this indication, but cover both locations with one tag. Again, an example for this can be DataSite, which defines geolocation as spatial region or named place where the data was gathered or about the data is focused. BLAM is defined as well a little bit vague, but narrows it down as following. Most relevant location for data. The information provided in this component is intended for discoverability in map-based browsing. This helps narrowing down the definition and makes sure what is expected to be in that tag. We have been talking much now about vague definitions, but what exactly is vagueness? We use this term to cover 4 types: vagueness, generality, uncertainty, and ambiguity. The term vagueness is best compared to fuzzy borders. As an example, we can take the quantity of a heap of rice. What makes a heap of rice? It is not defined clearly, but we all know it's not made of 1 grain or 2 grains or 1,000 grains, but we don't know how much exactly. This can be also demonstrated by DataSite's definition of language, the primary language of the resource. Is it the content language or is it the subject language? We don't know. Generality describes the non-specificity of something. For example, German is spoken in more than one country. When referring to German, one does not know to which German it is being referred. Also, Alemannic describes dialects that are spoken both in Germany and Switzerland. And Swiss German, again, does not specify which kind of German that is spoken in Switzerland is meant, since people living in Bern will speak differently than people living in Zurich. Uncertainty can occur in 2 places. One, when giving information, a researcher can not be sure about when they recorded their data. So they will put in a date, but they can't really tell, was it then when they recorded it? And me, as someone that searches for data, cannot recognize a field that has been filled out with certainty or uncertainty. And then again, when searching for data, uncertainty can occur. Will I find all relevant results? Some relevant information that I'm searching for is described in optional fields. Some researchers fill them out, some don't. Then lastly, ambiguity is best demonstrated by words that have more than one meaning. For example, the term Kui can describe a language in different countries, for example, Kui in India or Indonesia or Thailand, Laos or Cambodia. Next, we want to show you how vagueness can impact findability. For that, we use DataSite, which is not specialized for linguistic data, and OLEG, which is. First, we look at DataSite. We type in German to find all the resources that are related to the German language. And when clicking or scrolling through it, we also find a resource about the German language in Russian. This title translates to Teaching Business Correspondence in German for Specialists with Additional Qualifications, the Translator in the Field of Professional Communication. If you'd like to filter your results to only get resources in a specific language, either Russian or German, that is not possible with DataSite, as one can see with the available filters. Now, let's look at OLEG. Again, we type in German. Again, we want to filter, so we only can see results that are about German, in German. This time, we can filter subject language and content language. So if we were to click on German for content language to only get results in German, we would still find results in Russian. When taking a closer look, we can see that this is a translation of an introduction into Altaic linguistics by Gustav Jon Ramstedt that was translated from German into Russian. Correctly, the content language would be Russian, the subject language would be Altaic languages. The German language is only the source language, but otherwise not relevant to the resource. A hint to Altaic languages is only made in the Library of Congress subject headings tag. But how can we solve these issues? A few possible solutions will be now presented by Felix.
Thank you. As a community, we've come a long way, but there's still areas where we can improve our infrastructure or our practices. One area where we can still make progress is by improving our metadata formats. This mostly addresses, obviously, the archives. In some areas, we already have rather crisp definitions. For example, a lot of formats have, as we've seen, quite usable definitions for language. But in other areas, this type of vagueness still persists. For locations, for example, are an example, as we have seen. And even if we have crisp definitions of categories, the values we put into these categories might not be unambiguous. And there we can improve things by using non-literals. We already do this for language by using glottal codes or ISO codes, but there are other areas where identifiers would improve our metadata. This includes locations, but also topics, IDs for researchers, for creators, and so on. But when we use identifiers and controlled vocabularies, we have to agree as a research community, archivists and researchers alike, on these vocabularies. The best way is probably to use researcher-controlled vocabularies such as Glottolog, ORCID, or Wikidata, where the researchers can give direct input into the content of the vocabularies. In the end, we also need support for these vocabularies in the tools that support the creation of metadata, so that researchers have a fighting chance of using all these different vocabularies. But beyond the improvement of the infrastructure, we also have to improve our practices, and that obviously addresses archives and researchers alike. We have to avoid optional fields for core categories in metadata schemes because they introduce uncertainty when querying a catalog. But we also have to improve our practices and raise awareness of best practices so that researchers actually use the metadata formats to their full potential. In the end, I think one of the crucial points is that we take pivot formats seriously, and in our area, that's in particular OLAC. We should, as archives, only map our categories onto OLAC categories if it's really a good fit. And we have seen that in some of the examples where institutions map their metadata into OLAC in a way that produces a lot of vagueness and problems. And this requires us to start thinking about the export formats when we actually create our archives and when we fill our catalogs. And I think this is actually the area where we can make a lot of progress in the next years. Thank you. So you can find our slides on Zenodo if you follow one of these links. And if you want to contact us, do so via Twitter. That should be the best way. Thank you.